Alright, today's video is something I haven't done for quite a while, honestly, not since Red Dead Redemption 2, actually, I don't think, but it's a video type that I used to produce as a staple on the channel a couple of years ago, and I greatly enjoy doing. The subject is Borderlands tips and tricks, and today is the top 5 things every player should know to improve their overall experience. A lot of these tricks, probably all of them, if we're being totally upfront here, will be duplicated elsewhere by other creators. It's a really hot topic and everybody's going to be chiming in, but my goal is to condense 5 of these points into something useful rather than stretching one individual point into a 10-minute affair, so without further ado, let's get started. Tip number 1 is basic utility upgrades. When you first begin playing, the utility of your character is very low. This means less ammo, less inventory space, less of everything. As soon as you unlock Sanctuary, which plays the role of your home base in this game, and for many hours afterward throughout the campaign, I highly suggest that whenever you have a few $1,000s to spare, go to the shooting range and purchase utility upgrades. I did not personally do this in my own playthrough. I was spending my money elsewhere, not really considering the value of these different purchases, and as a result, my experience for the first dozen or so hours at least was less than ideal. The first round of upgrades is $1,000, the second is $3,000 I believe, and the third is $9,000. I would recommend buying the first and second tier of upgrades as quickly as humanly possible, and the third tier when it becomes comfortable to do so. Since the game has rather intense menu lag right now when you're sorting your inventory and the base ammo capacity is extremely low, this will verifiably make a difference in how comfortable your progression becomes if they can be acquired early on. It may seem like an obvious tip to some, but even if you are considering a cool weapon that you saw at a vendor elsewhere or something else entirely, I would urge any players having those thoughts to consider the fact that in the first campaign run, weapons will be outleveled rather fast, whereas these upgrades provide infinite utility. Tip number 2 is damage types. This is an area where there is a bit more nuance than what I will cover, but the basic gist is that certain types of damage are more effective against certain enemies and certain health bars. This is not so straightforward as always use whatever damage they are weak against, like some people will tell you, since oftentimes, and especially if you are over-leveled or have some good equipment, you'll be killing things faster than the time it takes to switch back and forth between the weapons. So in a lot of encounters, it really doesn't matter at all what type of gun you use against what enemy. However, when there are larger enemies with much more health, the damage types do come into play, and this will also become more important the lower your own relative level is compared to what you are facing, as well as how far you have progressed in the game. A basic rundown is as follows. Fire damage is good against red bar enemies, and often guns will say flat out highly effective against flesh. Shock or electric damage, blue damage, is effective against blue shield bars, and corrosive green damage is effective against yellow armor bars. There are also a few more damage types such as radiation, which is unmitigated by shields and health, but less effective against armor as far as I can tell, and cryo, another good option against yellow armor bars, but the fire, shock, and corrosive green types seem to be the most common. There are also guns that can drop with rotating sets of these elements, making them both highly effective against, for instance, armor and flesh, yellow and red bars, or shields and armor, blue and yellow bars, as an example. And these weapons are quite good for accelerating your run through the main story. I would suggest having multiple different damage types in your loadout at any one time. It is most important to have weapons that are strong enough to actually kill the enemies, so if you have a relatively low rank gun with an element that you do want, but you get a higher level drop that does not have a similar element, it is probably still worth it to switch over, but whenever possible, having different damage types means an easier time getting through tough enemies with different colored bars. Just keep in mind, again, that if enemies are dying very quickly, switching back and forth is probably a waste of time. Only do it when the progression feels slower and your weapons seem kind of weak. Tip number 3 is boss farming. This is yet again something a lot of players might be fully aware of, and it is something that practically every single YouTuber is going to cover 6 ways to Sunday with 10-minute videos each for 11 different boss types, all saying the exact same thing. But the basic gist is that you can farm the bosses, and those bosses give crazy good loot, awesome XP, and lots of money. The format is extremely simple and it doesn't take very long to tell you at all. For story bosses, just beat the boss, remember where they are located, go turn in the quest, finish that quest, and then run back to the area where you fought the boss. That's literally it. It doesn't take longer to explain than that. You can fight the boss again and again. They should appear same as before. And then when you win and pick up all of the good loot, just open your game menu and select quit game. Quitting like that will reload you at the closest checkpoint, which is typically located directly outside the boss arena, so you can just drop in and do it all again. This is a bit longer for certain open world bosses. There might be a longer run, but the format is still identical. When you find a boss creature or enemy that drops great loot, remember where it is, and you can easily farm it by hitting quit game and going back to that same spot after you kill it. There are a few different reasons to farm these bosses. The biggest is that some of them have unique legendaries. However, if you are still in your first playthrough, you can actually over-level that particular boss, which appears to make it impossible to get the legendary. So be careful with that. Once you beat the campaign your first time, you'll be on Mayhem difficulty, and then enemies actually scale to your level. So my honest advice is to maybe farm bosses a few times on your first run, I guess, but the majority of farming will take place after the campaign has been beaten. Brace yourself, however, because these bosses individually are probably going to get nerfed and buffed, as well as their drop rates, because it's literally like the YouTube clickbait plague right now of Borderlands 3 going on. The fastest way to farm and blah blah blah, with like every boss in the game getting its own feature for 10 minutes of blabbering, as if it's somehow a huge and unique discovery. Tip number 4 is defensive skills. Borderlands 3 is a bit unique in some aspects, and one of those aspects is the ease at which respecking is allowed. What you do in the early campaign isn't really going to be the same as how you play at level 50 and beyond, at least not usually it's not. With that in mind, I would advise selecting defensive survivability options instead of going purely offensive for the first couple dozen hours. The 4 characters obviously have different trees entirely, but 3 of them have strong defensive abilities that are not just convenient in a lot of fights. In a few, they are flat out necessary. A boss like Kilovolt, for example, actually shocks the entire floor at the same time. So if you do not have strong regen or a defensive capability of some kind, it can easily be a death sentence. I am personally playing as Amara, who has an ability that allows for percentage health regeneration when an action skill is used, and then I chose the action skill with the shortest cooldown. This will probably change drastically during the ending sections of the campaign and beyond, but early in the game it has been absolutely invaluable. Zane has some defensive options that revolve around how low his shield is, which will accomplish the exact same goal. Maz is a bit harder and is generally spec'd to offensive skills in all of her trees, but there are talents for damage mitigation and increased shields, which might come in handy, and Flak has some seriously powerful survivability, not just one option, but multiple, so it should be relatively easy for him to stay alive. Tip number 5 is map awareness. This may sound stupid to some people, I get it, but again, it is something that certain players may not be thinking about, and it is somewhat rewarding. On every map, there will be secondary goals called challenges. These aren't regular quests, keep that in mind. They are persistent objectives that are marked in a separate tab of your menu. The Typhon challenge is very simple. Find the 3 green Typhon log icons on the map. There will be a little terminal at each one of them. Use it, and then go find the Typhon chest that it directs you to. I have hardly done any of those, honestly, and the chest is actually a very good thing to open. However, as far as I can tell, they do not respawn, even when the campaign is completed. So you need to weigh that for yourself, whether or not you want the early gear or the chance at better stuff after you've played many hours. I might be wrong about this, but from all of my research and my own experience, they are not resetting. So waiting and not opening these until after you reach Mayhem mode might also be a viable strategy, since the gear contained clearly scales with your own level. Then there are the mini bosses and hunts, if you will. These will require you to track down a series of smaller enemies culminating in a boss of sorts that often has their own legendary loot in the drop table and also will be very rewarding overall. Since side questing or boss killing is effectively required by the game due to the heavy level bracketing system, you will need to be tracking down at least a few alternate objectives in your initial playthrough. And then after that, it's really up to you because enemies scale, but getting to that point is the important part. These hunts or bounties, or whatever they may individually be called, are often the most rewarding objectives I have seen outside of main story bosses. So if you see something that indicates fighting a specific enemy, I would suggest giving that mission a higher priority over others. The challenges also contain hijack missions for vehicle upgrades and some other stuff as well, but by and large they go under the radar since the game does not really focus on telling you that they exist or why it is good to check them out or what they individually do. Overall, it may simply be best to accelerate through the main story, since later on in Mayhem mode, there is an alternate form of progression, powerful upgrades, scaled level enemies, which is very convenient, and much more. But how you get there can either be painful or fun, depending on how well you interact with the world. These tips are more than likely duplicates in some form or another across a wide variety of videos, and I don't know how deep I want to go down the rabbit hole of Borderlands 3 guide content, but this one felt particularly relevant and also a return to the roots of the channel, since I have ignored this format for quite a long time. If you want to support, there are links down below, standard stuff like Patreon, Twitter, merch, etc., but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, I hope this has been helpful, and have a nice night.